The Silent Orchestra, Chapter 1. The final rest. How do you stab a man in the back while he's on a brightly lit stage in front of 1,000 witnesses and his entire orchestra, without a single person seeing a thing? Was it a ghost or the most audacious murder in history? This was the question that hung in the vast, gilded silence of the Grand Empress Concert Hall. It was a question that seemed to displace the very air, heavier and more oppressive than the final, crashing chord of the symphony that had concluded only moments before. The applause had been thunderous, a standing ovation, 1,000 people on their feet, their palms meeting in a rhythmic, roaring tribute. And on the podium, Maestro Viktor Orlov, the man they called the Tempest, had turned to accept it. He was a man of dramatic presence. Tall, with a wild mane of silver hair and eyes that burned with a furious, artistic fire. He had raised his arms, accepting the adulation not as a gift, but as his due. He had held the pose for a long, theatrical moment, the sound washing over him. Then he had bowed, a deep, formal bow from the waist. He never rose. The applause faltered, trickled into a confused murmur, and then died, replaced by a vast, echoing silence. The 1,000 witnesses, the 70 musicians on stage, all watched as the maestro simply remained folded, a dark shape on his podium. The first to move was the concertmistress Elena Rostova, a woman with a poised, severe beauty. She had risen from her chair, her violin still held delicately in one hand. She had taken 2 steps toward the podium, her brow furrowed in concern. "Maestro," her voice had been a quiet question in the cavernous hall. She had touched his shoulder. And it was then that she had seen it. It was then that a single, sharp gasp, not a scream, but a sudden, violent intake of air, had cut through the silence. It was then that the house lights had come up, bathing the stage and the stunned audience in a harsh, neutral light, revealing the impossible. Protruding from the back of Maestro Orlov's immaculate black tailcoat, just below the left shoulder blade, was a handle. It was not a grand, ornate thing. It was dark, slender, and brutally functional. It was the handle of a stiletto, plunged to the hilt. Detective Inspector Julian Vale stood on that same stage 2 hours later. The hall was empty now, save for the police. The vast, red velvet ocean of seats was a silent, accusing witness. The stage lights, however, remained on, hot and bright, casting a clinical, shadowless glare on the scene. The body was still there, now covered by a sheet, a stark white mound on the raised podium. Vale was a man who seemed designed for such silences. He was tall, thin, and wore his grey suit with a kind of weary patience. His movements were slow, methodical, his face quiet and observant. He did not look like a policeman. He looked like a scholar, or perhaps a man who had come to tune the grand piano that sat silent in the corner. He walked around the podium, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the wood. His gaze was not on the body, but on the space around it. He was surrounded, quite literally, by witnesses. He looked at the chairs, arranged in a precise semicircular orchestra map. The first violins mere feet away. The violas, the cellos, the woodwinds, the brass, the percussion. 70 musicians, 70 pairs of eyes, all directed for the most of the performance at the man on the podium. "Tell me again," Vale said, his voice a low, calm murmur that did not challenge the hall's acoustics. He was speaking to Sergeant Harris, a younger, uniformed officer who was dutifully taking notes, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet. "It's just as they all said, sir," Harris reported, his voice tight with disbelief. "They finished the symphony, Mahler's Fifth, a huge piece. He was electrifying, they said. Then the applause, he turned, he bowed, he just didn't get up. The 70 musicians on stage, not a one," Harris said, flipping a page. "I've got the first dozen statements. They were either watching him or watching the audience. They were all looking. No one approached the podium. No one rushed him. He turned, he bowed, and in that second, it happened." "It did not happen, Sergeant," Vale corrected gently. "It was done. A human hand inserted that. A human hand attached to a human body. That body had to be by necessity somewhere." Vale's gaze drifted to the concertmistress's chair, Elena Rostova. She was sitting in the front row of the stalls, a police blanket around her shoulders, staring blankly at the stage she had just fled. Her violin, a priceless Stradivarius, was in its case at her feet, as if she couldn't bear to be parted from it. She had been the closest. 2, maybe 3 feet away, Vale walked to her chair. He crouched, examining the floor. Nothing. He looked at the music stand, the score for Mahler's Fifth, a sea of complex, frantic notes. "Weapon," Vale mused, walking back to the podium. The forensics team was finished. They were waiting for his signal. "It's specific. A stiletto, sir, thin, long, about 9 inches. The coroner's man said it was professional. It went straight between the ribs, punctured the lung, clipped the aorta. he would have been dead in seconds, probably before he even completed the bow. He wasn't killed after he bowed. He was killed as he bowed, Vale clarified. The distinction was critical. The act of bowing, a deep forward bend, would have presented his back, but to whom the orchestra was in front of him, the audience was in front of him. When he turned to bow, the orchestra was behind him. Vale stood on the stage and reenacted it. He stood where Orlov had stood. He faced the empty red seats. He turned his back to the audience to face the now empty orchestra chairs. This was how he had conducted. Then he turned back to the audience. Raised his arms, imaginary applause washing over him. He lowered them, he bowed. As he bent forward, his back was presented, not to the orchestra behind him, but to the ceiling above him, and for a brief second to the front rows of his own musicians. He straightened. Rostova, he said to himself, the concertmistress. She was the closest 3 feet away. Could she have done it in that second? Sir, Harris interrupted. She was holding her violin, both hands, and, well, a stiletto, it's not something one just has. It is, Vale countered, if one plans to use it. He walked off the stage, his steps echoing on the short wooden stairs. He moved down the plush-carpeted aisle to where Elena Rostova sat. Her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back in a severe classical bun. Her eyes, when they met his, were not just shocked. They were empty, as if the music had been drained from her, leaving a hollow vessel. Miss Rostova, Vale said, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. I am Detective Inspector Vale. I am sorry for your loss. She repeated, her voice a dry, reedy whisper. It is not a loss, it is an impossibility. It is as if a page of music simply was never written. It makes no sense. You were the closest to him when he bowed. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the podium. I was watching his hands. I always watch his hands, even in applause. You see anyone approach him? No, her voice was firm, absolute. No one. It simply happened. Was done, Miss Rostova, Vale repeated, his quiet patience a counterpoint to her frayed nerves. Did he say anything when he turned, when he collapsed? She thought for a long, painful moment. No, nothing. He was triumphant. He turned to us just before he turned to the audience. He had that look, that fire. He hated us, you know. He hated us because we were not perfect. But tonight we were, and he almost smiled, turned to the audience. He bowed. You were watching. Yes, I saw him fold. I thought he was overcome with emotion. It was a joke among the strings that his passion would one day simply consume him, make his heart explode. She touched her own chest, but it was not his heart. The knife, Miss Rostova, the stiletto, have you ever seen it before? Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated fear. Seen it? No, why would I? It was. Where did it come from? That, Vale said, is the central question. He left her, walking back toward the stage. A ghost, the hook had proposed, or audacity. Vale did not believe in ghosts, but the audacity, the sheer theatrical audacity, that he understood. This was not a murder. This was a performance. A final, terrible coda added to the symphony. The killer was not a brute. The killer was a musician, or at least someone who understood the precise, clockwork timing of an orchestra. Where, Vale asked Harris, is the maestro's score? The score, sir, it was. On the podium. It's on the evidence table, bagged. Vale went to the podium. The forensics team was finally moving the maestro's body. Vale watched, his expression unreadable. He looked at the floor of the podium, a dark wooden box just large enough for a man to stand on, nothing else. Harris returned with a large plastic evidence bag. Inside was the score. It was enormous, a thick, leather-bound volume. Mahler Symphony No. 5. Vale took the bag. He did not open it. He simply held it. He looked at the cover. Then he looked through the plastic at the final page, the adagietto, the final crashing chord, and then the end. The score was filled with Orlov's own annotations, frantic, angry pencil marks in red and blue, faster, more fire, and in one place SLEPWLKOS. He was indeed a tempest. Vale's eyes scanned the final bar of music. The music ended, and then just below the final line in the wide, empty margin was a new mark. It was not in Orlov's frantic, expressive pencil. It was a single, precise mark made in a cold, blue ink. It was not a word. It was not a musical notation. It was a small, perfectly drawn circle with a single vertical line drawn through its center. The Greek letter phi. It looked, Vale thought, less like a message and more like a target. He looked up from the score, his gaze sweeping across the empty, silent orchestra chairs. 70 suspects, 70 witnesses, 70 people who had watched their conductor be murdered and who had perhaps been reading the very same marked score. Harris, Vale said, his voice a low, thoughtful hum. I don't want to talk to the musicians about what they saw. I want to talk to them about what they played. The Silent Orchestra Chapter 2, the mark of the silence of the Grand Empress Hall, was a different entity now, hours later. It was no longer the respectful hush of an audience, but the cold, sterile quiet of a crime scene. The stage lights, though still bright, seemed to have lost their warmth, casting a pale, clinical illumination on the polished wood. The body of Maestro Viktor Orlov had been removed, but the podium remained, an empty, accusing throne. Detective Inspector Julian Vale stood not on the stage, but in the orchestra pit below it. He was looking up, his gaze tracing the lines of sight. From here, the podium was high, dominant. He was trying to see the world as the musicians had seen it. He was trying to understand the geography of the impossible. He held the evidence bag containing the Mahler score. The mark in the final margin, the blue, precise circle bisected by a vertical line, $5, felt cold even through the plastic. It was a mark of intent, a target, a signature. Harris Vale's voice was a low murmur, absorbed by the plush red velvet of the seats. Sergeant Harris, who had been quietly interviewing a stagehand by the loading doors, approached, his notebook open. "Sir, the musicians, they are all being held." "Yes, sir. In the green room, the main lounge." "Wherever we could put them, they're shaken but cooperative, mostly. The first violinist, Rostova, she's just staring." "I want to speak to them," Vale said. "Not all at once. I want to speak to the principals, the section leaders, the concertmistress first again, and I need the other scores, all of them." "All 70, sir?" Harris looked daunted. "All 70, the principals, the ones closest to him. The first violin, the principal cello, the principal viola, the lead flute and oboe, the ones in the kill zone, let's call it." Vale's gaze was fixed on the semicircle of empty chairs on the stage. "I want to see if their scores bear the same mark, if this was a private message to Orlov or a public announcement to the entire orchestra." Green room was a cavern of faded grandeur. Pale green wallpaper, gilt-framed mirrors depicting pastoral scenes, and threadbare armchairs. It smelled of old dust, stale perfume, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. The principals of the orchestra were gathered there, a collection of pale, exhausted faces. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, huddled together, their instruments in their cases at their feet like life rafts. Elena Rostova sat apart, her back rigid. Vale approached her, his presence quiet, unthreatening. "Miss Rostova," he said, his voice barely disturbing the air. She looked up, her dark eyes hollow. "Inspector." "Your score," he said, not as a request, but a simple statement. "May I?" She gestured to the music stand by her side, which a stagehand had dutifully recovered. The thick, annotated score of the Mahler was still open. Vale turned to the final page. He ran his finger along the bottom margin. It was clean, no mark, no $5. He moved to the next. The principal cellist, a man named Antoine Dubois, a heavy, somber man with a thick beard. "Your score, Mr. Dubois." Dubois, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, merely pointed to it. Vale checked. The final page, clean. He checked the principal viola. Clean. The flute. Clean. Vale stood in the center of the room, the silence heavy with unasked questions. The mark, the target, was only on the maestro's score. It was a message intended only for him. A warning, or Vale thought, a final, cold instruction. He turned back to Elena Rostova. "You said," he almost smiled, "when he turned to you." "Before the bow," she nodded, her gaze distant. "It was unusual. He never smiled. He conducted with a controlled fury. He believed perfection was a bare minimum, not a triumph. But last night, yes," he looked satisfied, at peace. "It was the most disturbing expression I have ever seen on his face." "Peace," Vale mused. "A strange word for a man about to be murdered." Her voice was thin, or perhaps, he knew, perhaps he was, satisfied. That it was finally over. Implication hung in the air. Suicide? Vale looked back at the podium in his mind's eye. The handle, the angle, impossible. One cannot stab oneself in the back between the shoulder blades with such precision and force. No, this was an execution, but an execution the victim had expected. "Tell me about the stiletto," Vale said, his voice dropping. "We did not find a sheath, not on him, not on the stage." "Stiletto." Dubois, the cellist, spoke, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "Like a dagger, very thin, very sharp, 9 inches. A murmur went through the room. The wind section looked pale. It was the principal oboist, a young woman named Sarah Chen. That's a conductor's tool." Vale turned, his focus instantly sharpening on her. "Explain." "Not a weapon," she said, her hands fluttering, "but a tool the old masters, Toscanini, they used to carry them. Not stilettos exactly, but sharp, pointed batons, or letter openers. They were tyrants. Orlov, he was a tyrant. He had one." "Orlov had a stiletto?" Vale asked, his voice calm but with a new, cold precision. Not like that, Sarah stammered. On his desk, in his dressing room, a letter opener. It was a gift, I think, from Italy. It looked like a St. Dalto. Black handle, slender. We used to joke about it. That he used it to prune the weak players. Vale felt a cold click of understanding. The weapon had not been brought into the hall, it had been taken from within it. He kept it, Sarah continued, her voice trembling, right on his conducting stand in his dressing room, with his metronome. He said it inspired him. Where is the maestro's dressing room? Vale asked, his gaze shifting to Harris, who was standing by the door. This way, sir, top floor. Dar's room. Vale left the green room, the musicians staring after him, their silence now filled with a new, more specific dread. He walked the plush, carpeted hallways, the walls lined with framed, signed portraits of conductors and soloists from a forgotten age. He climbed the short, private staircase to the star dressing room. The door was unlocked. A police guard stood outside. The room was large, opulent, and in a state of controlled chaos. A dark suit was laid out on a velvet chaise lounge. An empty espresso cup sat on a vanity table. The air smelled of expensive cologne, rosin, and the faint, bitter scent of Orlov's nerves. And on the desk, beside a large wooden metronome that was ticking silently to itself, was a small velvet-lined box. A presentation box. It was open. And it was empty. Vale ran a gloved finger along the indentation in the velvet. It was long. It was slender. It was the exact size and shape of a 9-inch stiletto. The weapon had belonged to Orlov himself. The killer had not needed to smuggle a weapon onto the stage. They only needed access to this room sometime before the performance. They had taken the weapon. And then, what? How did they get it from this room up 2 flights of stairs, onto a brightly lit stage, and into the maestro's back unseen by 70 witnesses? The audacity. It was not just audacious. It was magical, a sleight of hand. Vale looked around the room. His eyes fell on the dressing room's music stand. On it sat Orlov's personal practice score, the Mahler Fifth. It was open to the final, triumphant page. Vale approached it slowly. His pulse, always a slow, methodical beat, did not quicken. He looked at the bottom margin of the last page. There, in the same cold, precise blue ink, was the symbol, $5. The killer had been in this room. They had taken the weapon, and they had left their calling card. Twice. A mark on the practice score and a mark on the performance score. A warning and then a confirmation. Vale looked at the ticking metronome. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was set to 60, a steady, funereal pace. The murder, Vale realized, was not about passion. It was not an act of impulse. It was about timing. As precise, as cold, and as inevitable as the metronome on the desk. He looked at the empty box. The killer had the weapon, but where was the sheath? A stiletto like that, a presentation piece, it would have a sheath. He looked in the box. Nothing. He ran his hand under the desk. Nothing, and then he saw it. Tucked inside the wooden shell of the metronome, through a small, decorative hole in the side, was a sliver of dark, tooled leather. The killer had hidden the empty sheath inside the ticking metronome. A private, chilling joke. A statement of intent. This was a person who did not just hate the maestro. This was a person who understood his mind. Someone who knew his habits, his tools, his private rooms. This was not a stranger. This was an intimate. Vale stood in the silent, ticking room, the empty velvet box before him. The question was no longer where the weapon had come from. The question was, who had the time? Chapter 3, the interval of opportunity. The investigation had fractured. What began as a single, impossible point in time, the second of the bow, had expanded, stretching backwards into the hours before the performance. The ticking metronome in Orlov's dressing room was a cold, mechanical heart, counting down to a murder that was now clearly premeditated. Detective Inspector Julian Vale returned to the green room. The atmosphere had soured, the shock replaced by a low, simmering anxiety, the kind that turns colleagues into suspects. The musicians, these artists, were not built for this kind of scrutiny. Their hands, designed for the delicate work of strings and keys, were now objects of forensic interest. Need a timeline, Vale announced, his voice cutting cleanly but quietly through the nervous murmurs. He addressed the entire room. The performance of Mahler's Fifth is long. It has 5 movements, but it also has an intermission. A few nods. The cellist, Dubois, spoke. After the scherzo, yes, 20 minutes, standard. 20 minutes, Vale repeated, tasting the words. The house lights come up. The audience retires to the lobby, and the orchestra... We come backstage, Elena Rostova said, her voice still thin. To the green room, to the lounges, some stay on stage to practice a passage, to prepare the maestro. Where did the maestro go? Vale asked, though he already knew the answer. To his room, she said. Always he did not socialize. He would lock his door. He would drink his espresso. He would. Center his fury, he called it. 20 minutes, a locked room. Killer who already had the weapon, the stiletto taken from its box hours or even days before. But how to get it to the stage? Vale's gaze swept the room. I need to know who did not come backstage, who remained on the stage during that 20-minute interval. The musicians looked at each other, their memories clouded by performance, adrenaline, and habit. I did, a small voice said. It was Sarah Chen, the oboist. Her face was pale. My reed, it was splitting. The humidity. I had to stay and work on a new one. I was in my chair. You were on stage, alone? Vale asked. No, not alone. She glanced nervously at the cellist. Mr. Dubois was there. He never leaves his instrument. He was practicing the adagietto. Dubois nodded, his heavy face grim. The cello introduction, it must be perfect. I stay, I focus. The audience, they are gone. It is quiet. So, Miss Chen, Mr. Dubois. You were on stage for the entire 20-minute interval? Yes, Dubois rumbled. No, Sarah Chen corrected, her voice small. I was there for perhaps 15 minutes. Then I had to use the loo just before the 3-minute call. I was gone for 2-3 minutes perhaps. You, Mr. Dubois, the cellist's brow furrowed. I was there. I was practicing. My eyes, they were closed. He demonstrated, his large hands moving in the air, his body swaying with an imaginary instrument, his eyes shut tight in concentration. You feel the music, you do not see. So for a period of approximately 3 minutes, Vale stated, you, Mr. Dubois, were on stage, your eyes closed, and you, Miss Chen, were absent. The stage was effectively unwatched. A cold silence fell. The impossible crime now had a window, a small 3-minute window of opportunity. A time when someone could have what, Inspector? Elena Rostova asked, her voice sharp, cutting. Tiptoe to the podium, in broad daylight. The stage lights they are low, but they are on. The stage hands are in the wings. Someone would have seen. Perhaps, Vale said, unless they were meant to be there. He turned to Sergeant Harris. The stage hands, the crew. I want to speak to the man who was on duty stage right, the one closest to the podium. Crew, unlike the musicians, were not gathered in a comfortable lounge. They were in the guts of the theater, a dim, dusty space under the stage, smelling of paint, old canvas, and machinery. The stage manager, a man named Riggs, was built like a heavyweight boxer, his face impassive. Yeah, I was there, Riggs said, his voice a low gravel. Stood by the curtain line, stage right, saw the whole thing. You see anyone approach the maestro? No, like everyone else. He bowed, he dropped. Simple as that. The intermission, Vale said. Tell me about the intermission. The stage was empty save for the cellist and the oboist. Mostly, Dubois was sowing away, eyes closed like always. The girl Chen, she was fiddling with her stick. Then she left, went to the loo. In those 3 minutes, Mr. Riggs, did anyone walk onto that stage? Riggs paused. He rubbed his jaw. The sound like sandpaper. No one walked on, not from the wings. I'd have seen him. Vale pressed, sensing the man's careful choice of words. Riggs sighed. It's the adagietto, the fourth movement. We have to change the setup just slightly for the strings. Vale's patience was absolute, but he felt a keen, sharp anticipation. Change the setup? How? The harp, Riggs said, as if it were obvious. The Mahler 5. It doesn't use the harp until the adagietto, so. During the intermission after the scherzo, we move the harp from the back where it's stored to its place, behind the violas. Who moves the harp? Me and Tom, my assistant. It's a 2-man job, thing's a beast. So in the 3-minute window, when Miss Chen was gone and Mr. Dubois had his eyes closed, you and your assistant were on stage moving a concert harp. That's right, Riggs said, defensive. But we were nowhere near the podium. The harp's place is 10-15 feet away. We roll it in, we set it, we get out. Takes maybe 90 seconds. We're ghosts, Inspector. We wear black. The audience, the musicians, they're not supposed to see us. It's the job, ghosts. Vale looked at the man's large, capable hands, a ghost moving a harp. And where do you get the harp from? Alcove, stage left, back behind the percussion. The podium, it's on the way. We have to roll the harp around the podium to get it in place. Vale's mind flashed with a cold, clear image. 2 men dressed in black, silent, practiced. They wheel a large, cumbersome object, an object that in itself is a perfect visual shield. They move as one, they pass the podium. The cellist is playing, his eyes closed. The stage is theirs, 90 seconds, more than enough time. Did anything unusual happen during the move? Vale asked. Riggs's face, impassive until now, flickered. He hesitated. Unusual, Mr. Riggs, a man is dead. Stagehand sighed, the sound heavy with a guilt he hadn't known he possessed. We bumped it, the podium. Tom, my assistant, he's new, he misjudged the turn, the harp. It grazed the corner of the podium, made a thump, a soft sound. The cellist notice? No, he was, in his world, lost. He didn't even flinch. It was nothing. Maestro Orlov's podium. It's heavy, solid oak, sir. Weighs a ton. It didn't move. We just touched it. Where is Tom? Vale asked, his voice a whisper. Riggs looked uncomfortable. He went home, he said. He said he was sick after it happened. He looked green. I told him to go. He's just a kid. Him, Vale said to Harris. Find Tom, now. Vale stood in the dusty, cavernous space beneath the stage. The impossible crime now had a window. It had a method of approach, a Trojan harp. And it had a new, terrified suspect, but one piece was wrong, the stiletto. The murder was elegant, precise, the work of a surgeon or an artist. It was not the clumsy work of a stagehand who misjudged a turn. It was not the act of a man who bumped the podium. The weapon was one of passion, of intimacy. The method was one of cold, brutalist logistics. The two didn't fit unless Vale's mind went back to the stage, the harp rolling past. Riggs on one side, Tom on the other. But could a third person have been there? He looked at Riggs. When you move the harp, Mr. Riggs, describe it to me exactly. Well, it's on wheels, but it's top-heavy, so I pull from the front, and Tom, he steers from the back. He's behind it, tucked right into the curve of the body to keep it balanced. So, Vale said, his voice a soft, dawning realization, your assistant, Tom, he is completely hidden. By the harp itself. Yeah, from the front, from the audience, yeah, he's invisible. From the side, Vale asked. From the cellist. If the cellist had his eyes open, he'd see him, but he didn't. A man dressed in black, completely shielded by a concert harp, rolling past the podium, his colleague in front unaware. He misjudges the turn. He bumps the podium, but the stab, the timing, the murder didn't happen then. It happened 2 hours later. Vale was confused. The logic was failing. You can't preset a stabbing, or can you? He looked at the dusty, complex machinery under the stage, the ropes, the pulleys, the counterweights. This was a theater, a place of illusion. He looked at Harris. Forget Tom, not yet. Get me the blueprints for the maestro's podium. I think we have been looking at this all wrong. We've been looking for a murderer. We should have been looking for a trap. Chapter 4. The ticking podium. The blueprints for the conductor's podium arrived in a cloud of dust, brought from the theater's archives by a bewildered-looking custodian. They were old, drawn on linen. The ink faded to a pale, ghostly blue. The Grand Empress Hall was an old building, a place from an era when craftsmanship was a form of art. Julian Vale spread the large sheet on a table in the stalls, the single, dim ghost light on the stage casting just enough illumination. Harris stood beside him, peering at the intricate, spidery lines. It's just a box, sir, Harris said, disappointed. Solid oak, trusswork inside for support, nothing special. Vale agreed, his voice a low, thoughtful hum. It's not special, it's perfect, it's simple, solid, but look here. He pointed with his pen to the side elevation, a small dotted line, an annotation. Access panel rear for weighting and internal bolting. Access panel, Vale mused. It's hollow, or at least partially. He walked back to the stage, to the podium. The forensics team had dusted it, photographed it, and left it. It was, as Harris had said, just a box. Solid, dark, imposing. Vale ran his gloved hands along the back, the side that would have faced the orchestra. His fingers found it. A line so perfectly joined with the wood grain as to be invisible. A panel. There was no handle, no lock. But when he pressed the corner, as indicated on the blueprint, a small section, about 2 feet square, gave a soft click. Harris brought a small pry bar from the forensic kit. Gently, Vale eased the panel open. The inside of the podium was dark. He shone his torch inside. It was not a simple hollow box, it was a machine. The trusswork Harris had seen on the blueprints was, in fact, a complex, custom-built steel frame, and mounted on that frame was a mechanism. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and precise piece of clockwork, a coiled, high-tension spring as thick as a man's thumb, a series of brass gears, an anchor escapement, the kind used in a grandfather clock, controlling the release of that spring, and at the end of a steel, articulated arm, a housing, a custom-built, velvet-lined clamp. It was empty. It was the exact size and the exact shape to hold a 9-inch stiletto. Vale's blood ran cold. He was not looking at a podium. He was looking at a murder weapon, a custom-built, delayed-action, mechanical assassination device. My God, Harris whispered, his voice hoarse. It's a trap, a spring gun. Precise than that, Sergeant, Vale said, his voice hushed in awe at the sheer, cold-blooded intellect. It's a clock. Look. He pointed his torch at the trigger mechanism. It was not a simple switch. It was connected via a thin, taut wire to a small, modified metronome. The same wooden metronome from Orlov's dressing room. No, not the same one. A second one. The killer had two. Metronome in the dressing room, Vale said, his mind racing. The one with the sheath hidden inside. That was a decoy, a piece of theater. This is the engine. He examined it. The metronome was set. The arm was pulled back, the heavy spring compressed. But it had not been triggered by the metronome's timing. Look at the wire, Vale said. He traced it. It ran from the escapement mechanism not to the metronome's clockwork, but to the base of the metronome itself. The bump, Vale said, the realization dawning, cold and bright. Riggs, the stagehand, he said they bumped the podium. A soft thump, gently so gently, touched the metronome. It was not bolted down, it was balanced, delicately, on a small greased pivot. It was, in effect, a tilt switch. The killer, Vale whispered, was Tom, or someone impersonating Tom, dressed in black, hidden by the harp. He rolls past. He accidentally bumps the podium. This metronome, it tips over. The tipping pulls the wire which releases the escapement. Just one tick, it arms the device, it starts the countdown. But the murder had happened 2 hours later. No, Vale said, his mind correcting himself. This is too complex, the escapement. It's not a timer, it's a release, the final trigger. It has to be something else. He scanned the mechanism again, his light playing over the brass gears. He saw a second wire, this one. It ran up toward the top of the podium, toward the floorboard where Orlov had stood. It's pressure sensitive, Vale said, his voice full of a cold, terrible respect. The bump, it armed the device. It set the spring, but the final trigger, the thing that released the arm, was Orlov himself. He explained, his mind seeing the clockwork in motion. The killer arms it during the intermission, a simple, invisible bump. The device is now live. The spring is coiled, the blade is set, but it is held by a final, delicate catch. The musicians return, the maestro returns. He stands on the podium for an hour, conducting. Nothing happens. Not, Harris asked, his face pale in the torchlight. Because, Vale said, pointing to the pressure plate, the device is triggered by a release of pressure, not the application of it. It's diabolical, he laid it out. Orlov stands on the podium, his weight. It holds the final catch down. It keeps the blade from firing. He is, in effect, holding his own executioner at bay, and he doesn't even know it. Vale's voice was barely a whisper. He conducts for an hour. The symphony ends. The applause. He turns to the orchestra. He turns to the audience. He is safe. He raises his arms. He is safe. And then he bows. The word hung in the air. He bows, Vale repeated. He leans forward. His weight shifts off the pressure plate. For the first time in an hour, he takes his weight off the trigger. The catch releases. The spring fires the blade. It's driven up through a perfectly drilled, almost invisible hole in the top of the podium and into his back. He is literally bowing into his own death. Harris looked physically ill. A ghost. It would have been Kinder. The audacity, Vale said. The impossible crime. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a ghost. It was a box, a music box of a kind. He stood up, the full, terrible genius of the crime settling on him. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of engineering, of art, of a mind that understood music and timing and clockwork. $5 symbol, Vale said. Wasn't a target. It was a diagram, a circle. The podium, a vertical line. The blade, it was the killer's, his signature, his blueprint. He looked at the empty orchestra chairs, the musicians. They were irrelevant, the stagehands. They were unknowingly the trigger. The who was the person who had built this. The person who had access, who had the skill. The person who knew Orlov's habits, who knew the music, who knew the timing of the intermission. Who, Vale asked, his voice low, had access to this podium before the intermission? Who could have installed this? Sir, it would have taken hours, Harris said. Days, Vale agreed. This wasn't built last night. This was a project. This was practiced. He thought of the two metronomes. The one in the dressing room, a deaky. The one in the podium, the trigger. He thought of the stiletto, Orlov's own, a piece of poetic, arrogant justice. And he thought of the musicians. He had been wrong. They were not irrelevant. One of them had a mind that was not filled with music, but with gears. Cellist, Vale said. Dubois, the man who never leaves his instrument. The man who sat 10 feet away, his eyes closed. While the trap was being armed, was he focusing, or was he listening for the thump, listening for the click of the metronome, the sound that told him that his art was ready? Vale looked at the stage. The impossible murder was solved, but now he had to prove it. He had to connect the man to the machine. The Silent Orchestra, Chapter 5. The clockmaker's son. The discovery of the mechanism inside the podium had fundamentally altered the air in the Grand Empress Hall. The crime was no longer a mystery of impossible speed, a sleight of hand in a second of darkness. It was a mystery of impossible patience. It was a crime of cold, meticulous, and patient engineering. It was the work of a mind that moved not with the chaotic passion of a tempest, but with the slow, steady, and inevitable tick of a clock. Detective Inspector Julian Vale left Sergeant Harris to oversee the delicate, painstaking dismantling of the podium. It was no longer just a piece of stage furniture. It was a complex, bespoke machine, and it was the central, silent witness. Every gear, every spring, every wire would need to be documented, catalogued, and preserved. Vale, meanwhile, walked away from the bright, clinical lights of the stage. He moved through the silent, red velvet ocean of the auditorium, his footsteps absorbed by the thick, plush carpet. He did not need to see the machine. He had understood it. What he needed to understand now was the mechanic, Antoine Dubois, the principal cellist, the man who sat mere feet away, his eyes closed in musical rapture, while a stagehand, Tom, accidentally bumped the podium and armed a murder weapon. He was the man who had provided the perfect, insulated moment for the trap to be set. Was he a witness or a collaborator, or was he, Vale suspected, the architect himself? This was not a question to be answered by musicians. This was a question for the archives. Vale did not go to the police precinct. He went instead to the city conservatory's administrative office, a quiet, dusty place that smelled of old paper and furniture wax. He was not, he explained to the elderly, bespectacled clerk, interested in Mr. Dubois' performance history. He was interested in his application, his student files, his next of kin, his history. The clerk, accustomed to the slow pace of academic research, found the file. Vale sat at a long, polished oak table, the only sound the distant, muffled thump of a badly practiced tuba from a room far below. He opened the folder. Antoine Dubois, born in Lyon, France, a prodigy. Scholarships, awards, a flawless musical lineage. His mother, a noted soprano, but his father was not a musician. Vale's finger stopped on the line. Father's occupation, horloger, a watchmaker, a clockmaker. Vale felt the cold, quiet click of a tumbler falling into place. This was not a coincidence. This was a resonance. A man who grew up not just with music, but with the sound of ticking, of gears, of mainsprings, and of the precise, mathematical division of time. He needed to see where this man lived. A man's home, Vale had always found, was a truer map of his mind than his words. Dubois' apartment was in one of the older, quieter squares, in a building of pale stone that overlooked a small, rain-soaked garden. There was no sound from within as Vale stood at the door. He had obtained a key from the building superintendent, a quiet, legal necessity. He opened the door. The apartment was silent. It was not the messy, bohemian collection of scores and wine bottles he might have expected from a principal musician. It was precise, it was immaculate. The floors were polished dark wood. The furniture was sparse, modern, and arranged with an almost painful geometry. There was not a single speck of dust. It was less a home and more a showroom, or Vale thought the inside of a clock. He walked through the quiet, sterile living room. He saw the cello case, standing in the corner, a dark single curve in a room of hard, straight lines. It was closed. He moved toward the back of the apartment, to a room that the superintendent had called the workshop. Vale pushed the door open. This was the mind of Antoine Dubois. It was not a musician's practice room. It was a horologist's dream. A long, sturdy workbench sat under a row of bright, clinical spotlights. The wall was a pegboard, hung with a meticulous, terrifying array of tools. Tiny files, loops, calipers, lathes, and small shining hammers. The workbench itself was a sea of brass and steel. Gears no larger than a fingernail sat in shallow, velvet-lined trays. Springs coiled like tiny silver snakes, and metronomes, dozens of them, in various states of disassembly. Wooden, plastic, antique, modern. Dubois. He was not just a musician, he was an obsessive. He was deconstructing and reconstructing the very concept of time. Vale's gaze was drawn to a set of drawings, laid out and held flat by small brass weights. They were not for a clock. They were drawn in the same pale blue ink as the $5 symbol. It was a schematic, an intricate, complex drawing of an articulated, spring-loaded arm connected to an anchor escapement. It was the blueprint for the murder weapon. Vale stood, absorbing the cold, terrible genius of it. Dubois had not just built the trap. He had designed it. He had perfected it. This was his symphony. And then he saw the motive. On the corner of the desk, away from the tools, was a small, neat stack of letters bound with a simple black ribbon. They were old, the paper yellowed, the ink faded. The return address was from a M. Fabien Dubois. The father, Vale, his gloved hands moving with slow, respectful care, untied the ribbon. the letters were not to Antoine. They were to Maestro Viktor Orlov. He read the first. It was dated 10 years prior. It was a letter of hope, a humble, eloquent plea from an agging clockmaker. Fabien Dubois explained that he had created a new metronome, a perfect design, one that used a magnetic escapement to produce a perfectly silent, perfectly accurate beat. He called it the Cœur Silencieux, the silent heart. He was offering it humbly to the great Maestro Orlov as a gift, as a tribute from one artist to another. The second letter was from Orlov's assistant, a curt, cold rejection. The maestro has no need of soulless boxes to keep his time, he is the time. The third letter, a year later, was from Fabien again. This one was more desperate. He had seen a new metronome, marketed by Orlov's own merchandise company. It was his design. The silent heart, repackaged, rebranded and stolen. He was begging for credit, for acknowledgement. The final letter was not a letter, it was a death certificate. Fabien Dubois died 6 years ago. Cause, suicide by hanging. Vale stood in the silent, precise workshop, the letters in his hand. The cold, sterile air of the room suddenly felt heavy, thick with a grief that had been compressed, coiled and finally sprung. This was not a murder. This was an execution. A slow, 10-year-long act of revenge. A son answering a father's stolen silence with a final, terrible tick. Vale looked at the workbench, at the sea of tiny, perfect gears. He knew now who had built the machine. But he needed the final piece. He needed to know from the hand that had armed it how it was set. He needed to speak to the stagehand. He needed to find Tom. Chapter 6. The confession of the hand. While Vale had been tracing the cold, precise lines of the architect's mind, Sergeant Harris had been hunting for the hand. He found Thomas Gable, Tom, not at his flat, but in a small, dark pub in a back alley, miles from the theater. He was, as Riggs the stagehand had described, just a kid. A music student, pale with frantic, terrified eyes and hands that trembled so badly he could barely lift his glass. He was brought not to the precinct, but to a quiet, neutral office in the theater itself, away from the musicians, away from the stage. Vale met him there. The room was small, meant for accounting, and smelled of ledger paper and radiator dust. Vale did not loom. He sat, his presence a calm, grey anchor in the boy's storm of panic. "Thomas," Vale began, his voice a low, steady murmur. "My name is Inspector Vale. You are not under arrest. You are here to help me understand. You were ill last night." Thomas flinches, a sharp, jerky movement. I was sick. I saw on the stage the maestro. I couldn't." He was rambling, his words tumbling out, desperate to be believed. "I am not," Vale said, his voice dropping, "talking about after the performance. I am talking about the intermission. You were moving the harp with Mr. Riggs." Tom's face went white, a stark, papery, bloodless white. He stopped trembling, he just froze. "You bumped the podium," Vale continued, his tone not an accusation but a simple statement of fact. A soft thump, a misjudged turn. Tom's eyes, wide and terrified, filled with tears. He was not a killer. He was a child who had been told to stand in the deep end and had just realized the bottom was a mile down. He told me to," Tom whispered, the words barely audible, a torrent of confession unlocked. He said it was a joke." "Who, Thomas?" Vale asked, his voice gentle. "Mr. Dubois. Antoine. He's my cello tutor. He's a genius. He's been mentoring me. He got me the job as a stagehand. He said it would be good for me to see the machine from the inside." Nodded, his expression unchanging. "Tell me about the joke." He said the maestro, Orlov, he was a tyrant, a man with no soul, no sense of humor. He said he wanted to break his composure, to give him a final review. That's what he called it. Tom was breathing fast, the words catching in his throat. He showed me weeks ago. He's got a key to the podium's back panel. He took me under the stage. He showed me the prank. He'd built it. He said it was a piece of theater, a joke. He showed me the spring, the arm. He said at the final bow, a flag was going to spring out, a big white flag with a review on it, or maybe glitter or something funny, something to make him look foolish at his big moment. White flag, the glitter, the grotesque, childish lie told to a hero-worshipping student. And the bump, Vale asked, his voice still a soft monotone. He said this, the mechanism, it needed to be set, that the bump, it was the trigger, it would arm it. He had me practice in the rehearsal hall with a dummy podium. He made me roll the spare harp past it and nudge it just right, not too hard, not too soft. a caress, he called it, a percussive note. Tom was openly weeping now, his face buried in his trembling hands. I didn't know, I swear, I didn't know, I bumped it just like we practiced, I felt the click. Inside I felt it, through the harp, a tiny click, and I knew it was armed. I was so excited, I couldn't wait to see Orlov's face. At the end, his voice broke a high, thin wail of pure, unadulterated horror. And then he bowed and he didn't get up and I saw this, the handle. I knew it wasn't a flag. It was me. I did it. Mr. Dubois, Vale interrupted, his voice cutting cleanly but not unkindly through the boy's hysteria. He paid you as £100, Tom sobbed, and 50 to get sick, to leave. He said, it completed the mystery. He smiled. He smiled. Vale stood. He had it. The complete, cold and terrible picture. The architect, the hand, the motive, the machine. He had the grief of the father and the cold, precise rage of the son. He had the innocent, terrified hand that had unknowingly set the final, terrible cog in motion. He placed a hand not on the boy's shoulder, but on the table beside him, a small, steadying point of contact. "Are a witness, Thomas," Vale said, his voice firm, clear. "You are not a murderer, but your part in this is not over. You will have to perform one more time. You will have to tell this story to a new audience." Left Tom with Harris, the boy's quiet, broken sobs echoing in the small, sterile room. He walked back alone toward the stage. The impossible crime was solved. All that remained was the final, quiet coda. He had to face the composer. Chapter 7, the final coda. The Grand Empress Hall was a tomb. The police, the forensics teams, the musicians, they were gone. The stage had been cleared, the podium taken to a laboratory, the chairs stacked. All that remained was the vast, dark ocean of the velvet seats, and the single, pale, solitary ghost light on the center of the bare stage. It was here that Julian Vale found him. Anton Dubois was sitting in his usual chair, his principal cellist's chair, though it was now alone on the vast, empty stage. His cello case lay at his feet. He was not playing, he was just sitting, staring out into the empty, darkened hall, a man watching a performance that had ended long ago. Vale's footsteps, soft as they were, echoed in the immense, hollow silence. Thump, thump, thump. A slow, methodical beat, like a metronome, approaching. He stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up. Dubois did not turn. "Mr. Dubois," Vale's voice was quiet, a simple statement. "He destroyed him, Inspector." Dubois' voice was not a confession. It was a continuation, a conversation that had been waiting in this room for 10 years. His voice was calm, resonant, not the voice of a man in a panic, but of a man who had finished. "My father," Dubois continued, his gaze fixed on the distant, dark balcony. "He was a genius. He didn't just make clocks. He understood time. He built automatons, a silver swan that swam, a writer that wrote poetry. He created life from years." He paused, the silence stretching, vast and heavy. "And he created Silencia, the silent heart, a perfect metronome for all of a gift from one artist to another." His voice was a low, steady musical rumble, a lament. Orlov, Dubois' voice dropped a cold, sharp note. He mocked him. He called my father's life's work a soulless box. He stole the design. He patented it and buried it, not to use it, but to kill it, to prove that he could. "So you built one for him," Vale said, his voice joining the slow, funereal rhythm. "A final, soulless box, a metronome," Dubois corrected, his voice resonating with a cold, pure pride. "A perfect metronome, my father's design. It kept its time for 2 hours. It waited. It listened to the music and then at the end, at the final rest, it performed it. It sang its one note perfectly. The stiletto," Vale said, his own Poetry, Dubois whispered. He loved his own drama, his tempest. He deserved as a theatrical ending, a man who lived by insulting the clock. He died by one. The Mark, Vale said, his voice a final soft question. The $5 in his score. Dubois for the first time turned his head. His eyes in the pale glow of the ghost light were peaceful, sane, and terribly sad. My father's mark, he said. His horologist's signature, the golden ratio, the divine proportion, the symbol of perfect harmony. I left it for him to see in both his scores, the one in his room and the one on the podium. I wanted him to conduct his final symphony, knowing that my father's genius was watching him, that his time was finally over. He stood slowly, the movement fluid, graceful. He was not a killer. He was a composer who had just finished his masterpiece. He picked up his cello case, his hand steady. Brought his father's silent heart to life. Mr. Dubois, Vale said, his voice quiet, you will need to come with me. Antoine Dubois nodded once. A final, slow and graceful acceptance. He walked to the edge of the stage and down the short wooden steps. He did not resist. He did not speak. Vale walked beside him out of the vast, dark and silent hall. The only sound in the entire cavernous building was the steady, rhythmic click, click, click of their heels on the hard marble floor of the lobby. A final, slow and terrible beat. The symphony was finally over.